Hello, everyone. I hope that you all had a wonderful long weekend. I wanted to check in and quickly recap our first discussion board and introduce this next week as we continue looking at what the meaning of gifted education is. Our main focus for this week is to revisit that myths and reality quiz that you took our first week of class and to do a reflection on that assignment after we've read some initial library content. So before digging into that assignment, I wanted to recap a couple of things on your discussion board. So remember that this is an online class, and unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to talk face to face. So our discussion board is really our best option in terms of how we are discussing the material. That being said, I did want to talk through the rubric for that assignment to make sure that we are all clear. So if you go to your learning module and you look at the section for the discussion board that we have for each module, you can see both the rubric and also an associated student exemplar of both a initial post and the student responses. So in terms of these responses, the big challenge is I don't really want to know only what you feel about the content. What I really want to know is your ability to synthesize all of the information that you have read in the library materials. So I've had a couple of questions of, there's a lot of reading, there's a lot of videos, how do I know what's important? The big takeaway from this class is not that you can close your book and memorize all of these names and all of these definitions. My big focus for you is that you can synthesize all of the information. So in terms of writing your discussion posts, think of it as I'm pulling a lot of different theories, a lot of different perspectives together to make my own argument rather than quoting from just two different sources. So the rubric does say that you are required to quote from at least two different sources, but typically I do look for more than that because I want to have evidence that you are synthesizing a lot of different content. Just a quick note in terms of APA citation, it is really important that you include what's called an internal citation. So when you do that, wherever you're getting your information, you need to cite both the author's last name and the year of the publication. Sometimes in this class, it may be hard to find that information. Please don't spend too much time. If you can't find the author's last name and the date, it is okay for you to just quote in parentheses the name of the document. For example, I believe like in the PowerPoints is specifically difficult. So let's say you had a PowerPoint on characteristics of gifted children. You can create an internal citation as characteristics of gifted children if that's the only material you can find. Another note with internal citations, and this is super important as you all progress in your academic career, if you are going to quote something word for word, which is okay, you need to give me a page number. Otherwise, it's a really big issue in terms of plagiarism. So do make sure if you're quoting, for example, a definition from, a lot of you quoted that definition from the Marlin report, make sure you give me the page number of where that citation comes from. You're not required to make a list of resources at the end, so as long as you have your internal citations in terms of APA style, you're good. I do just want to encourage you to dig a little deeper into the content as you're writing these discussion posts and be sure that you're bringing in as many different sources as possible. That would go into what we call having an informed response if you look at your rubric. I purposely do not interact too much on the discussion board. That's not because I don't want to. It's more because I want this to be a conversation between all of you. And I do chime into the discussion board at sometimes during the end of the week, but definitely here in these videos, I like to recap some of the ideas that you all said. But again, this is more about a class discussion, and sometimes I found that if I talk too much on the discussion board, it just kind of takes away from the discussion aspect of the course. So don't take my lack of explicit response as not looking and reading. I take the discussion boards really seriously and do enjoy learning from you all as I read them. So make sure next week when you have another discussion post due that you are really digging into the library content. I'll have my or do my best rather to have these graded by then so that you have something to go off of. And again, this just takes practice. You guys are doing a wonderful job. Just want to make sure that I'm being really clear with expectations. So leading into our discussion post, let's kind of recap what's going on with this case study. So one note about this class, all of these case studies are based off of real life experiences, especially next week's, which is one of my favorites. But this one, of course, I've changed all the names, but it is quite common in the educational world to be one of these gifted teachers and know in your heart that your children need to be more challenged, but have the administrator kind of just agree. So I wanted to call out a couple of students in terms of your responses on the discussion post and kind of lead our discussion from there. Just to start out, Sarah did a good job talking about the fact that being gifted is more than just above average intelligence. So she brought in discussing things like creativity and performing arts, and Riley brought in Renzulli's 3-ring concept of giftedness. So when we think of giftedness, oftentimes, and students think this, they just think it means I'm smart. So Joseph Renzulli, he's an incredible man. I do know him, not super personally, but I've met him. A lot of his research is about, well, isn't there more to giftedness than just my above average ability? So his 3 rings of giftedness include above average ability, creativity, and task commitment. For those of you who are more seasoned educators, you've probably heard task commitment defined as grit or maybe perseverance. There's some differences and minutiae in terms of what those words mean, but for our cases, it can be pretty much interchangeable. So it's not enough just to have that above average ability. We also need that task commitment and that creativity. I was glad to see that Riley brought in Renzulli's definition, and several others did as well, because if we're not approaching that above average ability and trying to really challenge these students, then we're definitely not going to be addressing that task commitment because they get bored, leads to underachievement, and most likely not creativity either. Delisha did a good job looking at the validity and the reliability of these tests. So the fact that the principal is saying, well, they're in the 95th percentile, they're doing great. My argument for the principal would be the fact that they're all in the 95th percentile is actually proof that they need to be further challenged. So what that 95th percentile means is compared to other 9th graders, so other same age peers, they are scoring the same or better than 95% of the students who took the test, meaning almost the same that they were in the top 5%. Not quite the same statistically, but it's okay with me for us to say that for now. So what that is saying is compared to the other 9th graders, they're really doing super well. And that is actually like one of the definitions of being gifted, because compared to their same age peers, they have this above average intelligence. A lot of times we have this assumption in education, and I believe, who should I give credit to? One of you said, I can't remember who it was, that we can't be satisfied with our students just doing all right. And I really love that quote because it's important to remember if we're focused on what we call closing the achievement gap, then the students who are chilling on the very top, they're often left out. And so if we're focusing on only closing the gaps, we often neglect the students who are at the very top. So this is not a valid measure of the students being challenged. This is a valid measure of how these students measure up to their same age peers. So it's not really telling us how challenged they are. This can be called the ceiling effect, meaning that they're kind of like capping out on this one assessment. So we don't know their actual intellectual ability because this test is not appropriate. One of the ways to get over that issue is actually to give students a test that is above their grade level and see their performance on that. and also to look at multiple indicators of potential giftedness rather than just one assessment. So several of you really dug into that validity and reliability issue. With validity, our key question is, are we measuring what we think we are measuring? This test is not measuring whether or not the students are challenged. This test is measuring whether or not they're doing well on the standards for the 9th grade. And clearly they are, because they're in the 95th percentile. Because of that, they need to be challenged more. So in this situation, if I were Mr. Taylor, I would try to help the teacher, or rather the administrator, understand that these scores are actually proof that they need to be further challenged. Anna Marie said that the high scores just mean they're able to reach the standards required, exactly as I would say it. Jenny did a good job saying, well, if we don't challenge these students, other problems are going to occur. So we have what's called underachievement with gifted students, and if gifted students are not challenged, they will underachieve. Oftentimes, I had a student when I taught high school who, I think she was failing my class. It was in my anatomy course, and I couldn't figure her out. So I stayed after work one day and looked up her test scores, and she was in like 98th, 99th percentile and everything. And she was bored. And when gifted students are bored, we'll see next week when we look at characteristics, most of the time, gifted students don't like the idea of just doing work for the sake of doing work. So why would I do my homework if I already understand the material? It just doesn't make sense to them. So oftentimes when gifted students are bored, they tend to underachieve, and it's a cycle of underachievement and a cycle of a lack of identification, and we really don't allow those students to reach their full potential. Apart from just being bored, you don't want them in your class because they're the students who are causing a lot of problems. When a gifted student is bored, they will challenge themselves in another way. Oftentimes that challenge will be challenging you as the teacher. So a lot of you guys did a good job digging through the academic boredom leading to some behavioral issues. I did want to make one note here. While I think it would be important to offer this AP English class to the students at 9th grade, I don't think that is enough in terms of serving their strengths and their needs associated with their gifts. I believe it was John who did a good job talking through that and saying we can approach our administrator, we can talk about how giftedness can be potentially met in these AP courses, but there's lots of different definitions of giftedness, and it's more than just this above average ability. And remember, this is only an AP English class. So yes, this would be a good step, but I would never say in a consulting position suggest that giving an AP English class is enough to serve the diverse strengths and needs of our gifted students. So I did want to make that very clear. I appreciated John saying that at least having this AP course would provide that communal aspect to the students, which is very important when we think about the social and emotional needs. But definitely there needs to be something else beyond just one above average AP course in terms of serving these students. So you'll quickly see that there's a lot going on here, and what's difficult and challenging in terms of gifted education is how different it is from district to district, from school to school, even from classroom to classroom. So it's important that we start the semester from these definitions of giftedness. We start this semester from this is how some researchers will define giftedness. It's important that we remember it's not just academic ability. In terms of that task commitment, in terms of that creativity, even thinking about leadership ability and artistic intelligence and athleticism. One point that I did want to make before moving on to this next section here is just a point of practicality. So when we work in gifted education, I think the biggest problem, in my opinion, is a lack of alignment between how we are defining giftedness and then the services that we are providing. So consider this case study from last week. If that school is defining giftedness as above average ability, let's just stop there, as above average ability, what if you have a student who is above average in math, but then your only source of services is an AP English class? That's a problem. So we have a lack of alignment between how we are defining giftedness and how we are serving it. In terms of consulting, that's the biggest problem I've seen. I've seen educational groups or teachers working together, and they have this huge, broad definition of giftedness, which is great from my perspective. We're identifying other gifts, but then they're only offering AP Math and AP English. So we need to make sure that the way we are defining giftedness is directly aligned to the way that we are serving those diverse needs and those diverse strengths. So that's one point that I did want to make. In terms of this week, there is no new discussion post. So remember, in each learning module, the first week is always a case study and a discussion post, and the second week is more of an activity or an individual assignment. So this week, I'm asking you to go back and look over your Myths and Realities survey. I ask you to keep tabs on which of the questions you answered correctly and incorrectly. And your assignment is to write a reflection on your performance on that assessment. So be sure that you go back and review the associated rubric, but I wanted to talk through your requirements on that. I'm looking for 3 main components. Which questions did you answer incorrectly, and which ones surprised you the most? It's fine if you just want to focus on a few. Maybe there were 2 that you missed and you were like, whoa, I was not expecting that. Focus there. So number 1, which questions did you not answer correctly? Number 2, what are some common themes among these questions? I've had students say, I had a common misunderstanding of the fact that I thought giftedness was always a positive thing. Or I've had a common misunderstanding of how to serve students with gifts and talents. Or a common misunderstanding of the social emotional needs of gifted students. So tell me which one surprised you most, any common themes among those questions, and then lastly, which of the content that we're starting to explore, what component are you most interested in exploring in further detail? So 3 components. Which questions did you answer incorrectly, common themes, and lastly, what is your content that you're most looking forward to exploring? Make sure that within that reflection, you are using these library sources to back you up. So if you look back at that rubric, there's a component on informed writing. So that's saying you're telling me evidence of why certain statements are true and what research is backing it up. So I am looking for evidence that you are citing your library materials within this. This is a good assignment for you to kind of just keep tabs on maybe some assumptions that you had about gifted students and how those are changing throughout the semester. Again, guys, this is a grad class rather. So I want you thinking critically. If there are things that you disagree with, I want you to think about that as we progress throughout the semester. I want you to always be thinking toward your final project, which is an independent research project. So if you are really interested in one content, remember that, because come April, we're going to be having some time for some independent research. So just to be clear, your only assignment this week is that Myths and Realities reflection. I'll be looking for that by Sunday evening. Do keep an eye out on the discussion board. Although you are not required to post anymore, I encourage you guys to keep interacting with each other. I will do my best to post your grades as soon as possible. And in the meantime, remember that I'm always here to answer any questions, and I hope that you all have a wonderful week. Thank you.